Triumphant Light metagame is starting to settle down for Pokemon Pocket, so today we've got an updated best decks tier list. We're going to cover rankings of all of the commonly played decks in the metagame, from the things that are kind of stinky to the ones that are absolutely crushing it. Let's get to it. As always, we start at the bottom, and the D is for Dragonite tier, featuring its namesake that continues to see regular play despite never putting up competitive results, and it's joined by its Gen 2 pseudo-legendary this time around, Tyranitar, who is not only added to the game, but is also on the booster pack for Triumphant Light, and yet is absolutely mediocre. If you're someone that enjoys these iconic Pokemon, these two deck lists on the screen are probably the least bad builds that I've played with them, but again, I'm not going to sell you on the fact that they're good. They're in the Dragonite tier for a reason. This tier's namesake has a few problems. It's a stage 2 Pokemon, which is inconsistent. It's a 2-color energy attack, which is inconsistent, and Draco Meteor drops randomly on the board, also inconsistent. Tyranitar is at least only 1 color, but it needs 4 energy to attack, and to hit the big breakpoint that you want to hit, this is kind of a super stage 2 in a way, because you need your 3 cards to evolve it, and you need an Arceus in the back to get its Link ability online to actually deal that consistent one-shot amount of damage. As we move into the C tier, I would like to start by saying I think this is the most competitive group of C tier decks I've ever ranked in a video like this. The current metagame allows for a lot of different things to be successful, it feels like, and every deck list in here has made deep runs in more than one community tournament at this point during the brief lifespan that this metagame has had. The C tier decks right now, in my opinion, are Celebi decks featuring either Exeggutor or Leafeon as their lead, Charizard Moltres, Skarmory Magnezone, Blastoise variations, Gyarados variations, Garchomp variations, Infernape Arceus variations, Leafeon Irida, Grass Pokemon playing Water Energy decks, and then the various berry decks that have been putting up results. Both of these Celebi variations follow a very similar mold with slightly different upsides and downsides depending on which stage 1 you choose as your lead. Leafeon is a little bit less bulky but deals more consistent damage and is better when going second, while Exeggutor can take a bigger hit and is better when going first. The big upside to Leafeon, however, is that its Pokemon ability lets you charge up Celebi a lot quicker on your bench, so that means even though Leafeon's going to get KO'd a little bit quicker on average, your Celebi is also much more consistent when it comes to the active spot, ready to start clearing things out in one hit more frequently. These grass decks have been pushed largely to the C tier by the fact that their Dialga Arceus matchup, the best deck in the format, leaves a lot to be desired. Those deck lists hit you really hard and fast with an Arceus that generally clears even an Exeggutor in 2 hits, even through a copy of Giant, Cape, and Erica, making your sustain a lot less effective than it was inside of previous metagames. That being said, if you can dodge the #1 deck in the format, this archetype still has pretty solid matchups into everything that is water-based and a lot of the other more random stuff that we're going to cover in today's tier list. The Charizard Moltres deck basically remains entirely unchanged from previous seasons, not getting any meaningful pickups. The metagame at the top has shifted in a way that's pretty hostile to it. This deck lines up poorly into Rampardos Fighting, Dialga Arceus, and all the various Misty Water decks that are running around that have quite aggressive starts. Its strongest matchup, the Celebi variations that we just talked about a moment ago, are far less popular than they were as their power level fell off, and thus Charizard doesn't really have anything in the metagame to prey on. Skarmory Magnezone is another one's top deck from our previous metagame that has struggled to gain good footing against most of the top decks in our new metagame. It's worth noting that this one does at least have strong matchups into the 18 Trainer Misty decks, as well as Manaphy things that are running around, since Skarmory can clean that out in one shot. That being said, you're going to struggle into Rampardos decks because their namesake clears out your namesake Magnezone in one go due to weakness, and the Arceus Dialga decks have such bulky attackers with so much sustain with capes and potions that you have a difficult time getting through them before they get set up to start clearing you every turn. I think Blastoise variations are the thing that have the highest probability of having some upward mobility in a tier list like this if more people pick them up and optimize them. In particular, these decks' namesake, Blastoise hitting 160 damage as a breakpoint every single turn is really appealing in a metagame where Arceus frequently wearing a giant cape is something you desperately want to be knocking out ASAP. You also have a really hefty HP pool, meaning you're never going to get cleared by an Arceus when it comes up and you're already in that active spot. That being said, I don't feel comfortable putting these archetypes higher than C right now because they only have a few sporadic results and not a huge play rate. Gyarados decks had a rough go of things during the Space-Time Smackdown expansion as the competitive metagame optimized to play more Executor decks that were ready to run down Druddigon and ultimately their finishing threat before you were able to really get it set up. That being said, these lists on your screen have put up some sporadic results in tournaments so far, but similar to Blastoise, they don't really have a high play rate because there aren't any new or exciting cards to slot into here, which means players tend to be slower when it comes to picking them back up and re-exploring old things that could be good as the metagame has shifted to be less aggressive. These seem like excellent decks to try out, and I wouldn't be surprised if they're quite reasonable. Garchomp is one of my favorite characters in the Pokemon franchise, and its new EX card I think is quite sweet and fun to execute correctly, having 2 different attacks, one of which lets you make up to 4 choices every turn is really interesting to navigate and master inside of the gameplay. That being said, from a pure numbers perspective, I can't lie to you, it is definitely a worse finisher by the numbers for these fighting decks than things like Gallade or Rampardos that we're going to talk about in the higher tier rankings today. Infernape got some really quality upgrades this expansion. Heatran in particular operates as both a lead 1 knockout point Pokemon that can buy you time to build up your namesake heavy hitter in the back, that also acts as a backup plan when your Chimchar is nowhere to be found, into things that are weak to fire, like Dialga. You hit for 60 and then 100 after they deal a little bit of damage for you, letting you close things out very, very quickly. That being said, these deck lists have been coming up quite a bit short inside of tournaments so far, which I would wager is a testament to the fact that any deck that's depending very heavily on a stage 2 Pokemon to be successful is just going to struggle to be top tier in our existing card pool. This all water energy, all grass Pokemon deck is really novel. Essentially, your things effectively attack for colorless, meaning if you play only water energy, you can play Erica in addition to Irida to keep your things very healthy from chip shot damage. That being said, your matchup table tends to be pretty polarized because while you absolutely dunk on things that are hitting you with chip shots, such as Darkrai, the best decks in the metagame right now are smashing you for 150 with a Rampardos backed up by Lucario, or an Arceus dealing 140 every single turn, which makes it difficult to keep up with your smaller amounts of healing. Berry variations are another one of the things in today's deck roundup that I think if they started seeing more play and optimization, they have the potential to move up to a higher tier in a future rankings video. In particular, I think the appeal of playing a bunch of single knockout point Pokemon that have triple-digit HP and deal triple-digit damage has the ability to run down a lot of things in our metagame. Berry as a card is just the type of effect that tends to be very potent inside of TCGs. Cheating on resources is frequently quite strong. The 2 Snorlax Magnezone variations on your screen have put up a handful of results in tournaments already, while the Staraptor variation that I showed here is likely a little bit less powerful and consistent, but still fun, so I wanted to throw it in. Moving along to our B tier, all of these deck lists are regularly putting up top finishes in some of our biggest tournaments, but their starting metagame share is not terribly high, so you also won't really bat an eye if you look at a top cut and any of them are missing. The B tier decks in our metagame right now, in my opinion, are Darkrai Magnezone, Weavile Darkrai, Arceus variations featuring Carnivine, Arceus variations featuring Crobat, and fighting decks featuring Gallade as their stage 2 finisher. Darkrai Magnezone is the previous season's best deck that occupies an interesting spot in our existing metagame. It struggles into the top dog Dialga Arceus, but it's pretty stellar into the fighting variations that are running around like Rampardos, and sports a relatively even matchup into the various Water Misty decks, both the 18 trainer variations and the Palkia ones that have been popular. Weavile Darkrai actually sports a very similar matchup table to Darkrai Magnezone, but it has a little bit higher variance in its gameplay. A lot of the strength in this archetype comes from assembling not only your stage 1 Weavile early, but also a Darkrai behind it so you can continue putting up chip shot damage on your opponent's active Pokemon. This means while your best draws are more powerful than the Magnezone variations, you're going to get them less frequently, meaning your average draw is a bit worse. If I were to pick a dark horse deck to potentially break out from today's tier list, Arceus Carnivine variations would be the one I'd put my money on. Both the Rotom variations that are able to do their best fighting box impersonation of bobbing and weaving between hitting your opponent's active for a lot of damage and cracking into their bench to Cyrus up, as well as the Executor build that has incredibly good draws when you're going first with Executor or when you're going second with Carnivine to put immense amount of pressures on your opponent. These deck lists really feel like they have play into basically everything in the metagame. I'm only putting them in the B tier, however, because despite pretty consistent results, their play rate is really low, and I think you need a larger metagame share than either of these deck lists currently have to get a ranking higher than B in a video like this one. I think there's a compelling argument to be made that Crobat's link ability with Arceus is the most powerful in the set. Getting to deal 30 chip shot damage from the bench is so incredibly potent. When you combine it with our Pokegod, this means you're clearing things with 160 HP in a single turn, which wipes out most things in the metagame in a single shot. That being said, this is a stage 2 Pokemon you have to assemble to get this powerful effect, which is why I would wager it hasn't had more popularity, because while the games where you get everything set up, you feel unbeatable, you also have to muck through a bunch of games where things don't come together for you, and then you're kind of just hoping either your Darkrai plan in one of these decks or the Heatran plan in the other is enough to drag you across the finish line. Speaking of, a noteworthy thing in the Heatran deck is that you are not playing any dark energy. Your Zubat and your Golbat attack for colorless, so they can do chip shots with your fire energy, and then by the time you're ready to put Crobat out, you can retreat it for free back to your bench to be attacking with either Heatran or Arceus in that lead position. Our last deck in the B tier today is Fighting Variations featuring Gallade as their finisher. I think the most appealing thing about this archetype is that you have draws that let you absolutely dominate the best decks in the format's best draw. In particular, if you lead a Hitmonlee, you can kick an Arceus in the back once or twice while you evolve a Gallade up. You can get that second energy on your Gallade, you can Cyrus that Arceus up before it has a chance to attack, and you can knock it out in one clean strike. Then Gallade has enough HP left over that it can typically deal with a Dialga or whatever else they have built up behind it, single-handedly winning you the game. That being said, you can see as this particular sample list is built, it doesn't really have stellar backup plans outside of Gallade. And I've mentioned a couple of times in this video, leaning heavily on just a stage 2 to do all of your lifting, even in a deck with 2 Pokemon communication, means you're bound to have a failure rate in some amount of your games. As we move along to the A tier, there are currently 3 deck lists that are a cut above most of the rest that you heard me reference in matchup tables in the other parts of this video. Our A tier decks right now, in my opinion, are Rampardos Lucario Fighting Variations, 18 Trainer Misty Variations, and Manaphy Double Palkia. Rampardos Lucario has some of the more polarized matchups in our metagame, having something of a rock, paper, scissors relationship with other decks at the top. It tends to be very strong against Dialga Arceus, but it comes up short against the 18 Trainer Misty Variations. Against other things in the metagame, its strength or weakness tends to largely depend on how many EX Pokemon those decks tend to lead, since Sudowoodo is a very powerful and potent part of this fighting deck's kit in a lot of the games that it's playing. The 18 Trainer Misty Variations are pretty emotionally taxing to play with and against, but when you take a step back and look at the matchup data we have from Pokemon Pocket's larger tournaments, we see they really tend to excel against decks that are dealing smaller chip shots worth of damage because they've gained access to Irida in addition to things like Giant Cape and Potion to keep their lead consistent attacker alive, and they struggle into things like the metagame powerhouse Arceus Dialga that are hitting them for multiple large chip shots in a row that that you can't heal your way out of. For my old Magic the Gathering players out there, I would describe Manaphy Double Palkia as the Jund deck of our current metagame. This is to say that it doesn't have any polarizingly good matchups, but also doesn't have any polarizingly bad ones. You also have draws where you occasionally get a free win because your Misty does something crazy, and I honestly expect that we're going to see this deck continue to pick up in popularity because this style of matchups is one that more competitive players tend to favor, so they can feel like they can have a chance in every game that they're playing. Last but certainly not least, this leaves us with just the S tier decks to cover today, which are occupied solely by Dialga Arceus right now, in my opinion. You've heard me talk about this deck's matchups in a variety of other places in this video here today, unless you're one of the folks that skipped right to this S tier section, in which case you should really go back and watch the rest. There's a ton of sweet decks that are very reasonable and competitive in this metagame. That being said, there's no denying that much of the metagame is warped around whether or not you can compete with this deck or this deck's counters. This deck is not only powerful at what it does, it is more importantly very consistent, allowing it to consistently dominate tournaments. Specifically, it is all basic Pokemon, meaning you get to play a ton of utility cards, such as giant capes and potions that allow your cards to stay alive longer, dealing lots of sustained damage over the course of the game. I'll be curious to see if other things from our slightly lower tiers like Manaphy Palkia that I hinted at can potentially gain meta share and push this deck out of the top. But as we're 2 weeks into Triumphant Light's metagame developing as of right now, this deck is clearly the top dog until something else can change. Thanks for making it through to the end of today's video. If you enjoy this more detailed tier list format, I would love to hear from you in the comments down below. Do you think it's worth getting into the nitty-gritty details and matchups that these different deck lists have, or should I stick simply to the power rankings and keep things a little bit more concise? If you enjoyed the video, make sure you smash the like button on it. If you want to find more thoughtful Pokemon Pocket content like this here 7 days a week, make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss any of the upcoming excellent stuff that I have, such as my weekly metagame reports where I do deep dives on what's developing in the tournament metagame. I appreciate you making it all the way through to the end, and I hope your next pack is an excellent one.